Let the healing begin, Boris Johnson declared today in a victory speech on the steps of Number 10, aimed at bringing a fractured country back together. He insisted the focus would be on the NHS, but his landslide victory puts Brexit right back on the immediate agenda. The Withdrawal Bill likely to go before MPs next week, and it will put Scottish independence front and centre too, thanks to a resurgent SNP. As for Labour, with their worst results since the 30s, the political recriminations begin and the search for a new leader. Let's take a look at the result by numbers. With all seats declared, the Conservatives have 365 MPs. Labour has 203, fewer than Michael Foot won in the 1983 election. The SNP will have 48 seats and the Lib Dems just 11. All that means Boris Johnson will enjoy a majority of 80. The Tories have gained 47 seats on the 2017 result. Labour have lost 59. The SNP picked up 13 and the Lib Dems are down 1. Boris Johnson won just over 43% of the vote, only a slight improvement on Theresa May's performance, but Labour took just 32%, with the Lib Dems on 11. The big story, Labour's vote share is down by nearly 8 percentage points, and especially in its northern heartlands. The Lib Dem vote did rise significantly, but not enough to win seats. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is with me again. Gary.
The big significance of last night is that Brexit is now happening. If you have a pro-second referendum banner, a blue beret with stars on it, put it away in the cupboard. That is not going to happen. What is going to happen is Brexit, and Boris Johnson is going to move as fast as he possibly can to make sure that the first phase of that, the delivery of the divorce bill into law, us actually technically leaving EU, happens very quickly, potentially with the second reading of that bill a week today. What he does actually in terms of the new relationship is an interesting open question, because an awful lot of people are wondering where exactly he will take that. Everybody's wondering whether he can remotely keep to the timetable he's set. But all of that, getting over the timetable, blurring that, maybe tacking slightly closer to Europe than people might expect, all of that becomes possible because he's a man with a great big hefty majority now, something we haven't seen, of course, in Downing Street for some time. But the other massive thing about last night is what it does for the realignment of British politics. You've been talking there about what's happened to Labour's heartlands. The most obvious comparison that we keep going back to understand last night is what happened under Michael Foot in 1983, when the party reduced to what we thought was its irreducible core. Labour now controls only half of the seats that were in that irreducible core. It is an extraordinary transformation of our politics, and the seats that they are left with are potentially more vulnerable to other sort of sweeps and changes or new political movements that could crop up. We have, of course, a different kind of general election in Scotland. It looks as though a constitutional crisis is coming towards us. In Northern Ireland, as you said, some very interesting changes, with for the first time Unionists not holding the majority of seats. There are occasionally general elections, we have seen them in the past, where not much actually changes. This is most emphatically not one of those.
He's back, and with a majority bigger than many in his team had ever dared to dream of. Boris Johnson, now the most powerful Prime Minister since Tony Blair. And after the Queen formally asked him to form a government, he spoke to those voters in the old Labour heartlands who'd given him their votes.
To all those who voted for us for the first time, and those whose pencils may have wavered over the ballot, and who heard the voices of their parents and their grandparents whispering anxiously in their ears, I say thank you for the trust you have placed in us and in me, and we will work round the clock to repay your trust and to deliver on your priorities with a Parliament that works for you.
Watched by his team, including advisor Dominic Cummings, he called on the nation to come together.
I frankly urge everyone on either side of what are, after 3.5 years, after all, an increasingly arid argument, I urge everyone to find closure and to let the healing begin.
Ian Levy, the Conservative Party candidate, 17,000.
It was a night of Tory wins in seats Labour thought it could not lose, like Blythe Valley. Bassett Law too, the drawn-out saga of Brexit driving Leave-supporting Labour backers into the arms of the Tories. But you couldn't, some said, park all the blame on Brexit.
It wasn't just about Brexit, it was also wider about the perceptions of the party and the leadership.
Has Jeremy Corbyn cost you your job tonight?
Yes, absolutely, completely. But I shouldn't be surprised in that because Jeremy Corbyn and I have very, very little in common. We just both happen to be members of the Labour Party.
Corbyn was a disaster on the doorstep. Everyone knew that he couldn't lead the working class out of a paper bag. Now John's developed this momentum group, this party within a party, aiming to keep the purity. The culture of betrayal goes on. You'll hear it now more and more over the next couple of days as this little cult get their act together. I want them out of the party. I want momentum gone.
I think that would be a disaster for the Labour Party and a disaster for the politics of this country.
Wheeled out of Labour campaign headquarters, a whiteboard of Tory gains. Was it wiped clean, or did they give up writing them down? There were 54 Tory gains from Labour. Jeremy Corbyn announced he'd stand down when a new leader was in place, a process aides said that could take a minimum of 3 months. He insisted his manifesto was the right one, but the media had been hostile, and Brexit was at the heart of Labour's disastrous result.
I think the issue that dominated this election ultimately was Brexit. Our policies, I've named some, and there are many others I could name, were actually all of them individually very popular. There was no huge debate or disagreement in the party about any of the policies in our manifesto.
Labour Party, 22,000.
Chingford, a Labour target that slipped from the party's grasp. Tonight, the Unite General Secretary Len McCluskey described the manifesto as an incontinent mess of unbelievable promises. While Labour argues about where next, back in number 10, Dominic Cummings has been leading the planning for domestic policy. Some in Whitehall worry what he might have in store. This morning, cameras caught him offering his hand to the Cabinet Secretary, Sir Mark Sedwill. One thing definitely in store, the fast-track progress of the Brexit divorce bill. After another Queen's speech next Thursday, the second reading is expected a week today. A big majority now guaranteed. Just as a strengthened Boris Johnson implements a plan Northern Ireland's DUP loathe, the party's lost its deputy leader, Nigel Dodds, and unionists, for the first time, no longer hold the majority of Northern Ireland Westminster seats. The Lib Dems' Jo Swinson had called for this early election and was its biggest casualty, losing her seat to the SNP barely 5 months into her leadership.
Whether people attacked my vision or my voice, my ideas or my earrings, one of the realities of smashing glass ceilings is that a lot of broken glass comes down on your head.
On a personal level, I do feel for Jo Swinson. It's not easy to lead a campaign, and to lose her seat is a really cruel blow. So yes, I do have a lot of sympathy.
All that was well hidden when Nicola Sturgeon actually heard the news. There was a lot for the SNP to celebrate, back up to 48 of the 59 seats in Scotland. The SNP leader says Boris Johnson must now give Scotland a second referendum on independence, a cause she believes Brexit will greatly strengthen.
Getting Brexit done is now the irrefutable, irresistible, unarguable decision of the British people. And with this election, I think we've put an end to all those miserable threats of a second referendum.
He insists he wants to meld one nation. But looking at how Leave and Remain seats voted differently, you see how difficult that might be. If you look at the seats that voted strongly for Leave, 60% plus, there was a much bigger swing to the Tories here. If it was up to them, if all the seats behaved like these, the Tories would have a 118 majority now. Look at seats that voted strongly for Remain in the referendum and the swings are different. If it was down to them, the Tories would be clinging on with a majority of 6. As it is, he's back with 80. A whole new voter base he must please. A timetable for EU trade negotiations many think unachievable. But a massive majority that gives a leader authority to act. Not seen in this place for some years.
Well, earlier I spoke to the Conservative MP Gillian Keegan, and I began by asking her how Boris Johnson can unite the country when the election results suggest it is still bitterly divided.
I don't think the votes do suggest it's bitterly divided. I mean, you know, we've been talking about one nation conservatism. We actually represent every nation. We have more seats in Wales now. We have 6 seats still in Scotland. We've got seats in the northeast, the northwest. We've got seats in the Midlands. We've got seats all over the country. So we represent every part of the country. We represent every different type of people in the country as well, from every different socio-demographic. So that's the start. If you're talking about leave and remain, how you unite those people who still may feel they want to remain, then the answer there is to do a sensible Brexit, a good deal with the EU, and make sure the voices of the 4 nations, and particularly young people, are heard in the next stage of the negotiation.
Do you see any problem with Boris Johnson claiming a mandate for leaving the EU when, in fact, more people voted for parties that want a second referendum or to revoke than parties that are committed to leaving?
In our system, if this doesn't give a mandate, nothing ever will. Of course it does. You know, look, the Parliament has been stuck. The British people have basically cleared the way through and said, here you go, get on with it. We want to leave with a deal.
And so what kind of government do you think this is going to be? I mean, you know, because we've heard this before. We heard this from Theresa May, talking about wanting to tackle the great injustices, and nothing very much happened. I mean, do you think he will deliver when he says, you know, he wants to address the concerns of those people who lent him their votes?
That is what we all want to do. The Labour Party and other parties try to pretend or try to proclaim that they've got superior value sets. Every single person in politics wants to tackle the same issues we have in our country. We just think we've got a better, more credible plan to do it.
Do you have any concerns about the other agendas that go along with this, though? I mean, those sort of rather oblique references in the Conservative Party manifesto to looking at the Constitution, the Supreme Court, their approach to the media. All of those sorts of things could change at the same time.
I don't, because honestly I think what defines the Conservative Party, and the reason I'm a Conservative, is sensible, pragmatic policies. So the Conservative Party is never going to be extreme. People try to paint us as extreme, but we're not. We're actually a centrist, by nature very centrist. This majority means we will have the ability to be a true one-nation Conservative government, unlike that we haven't seen for decades, and I'm very excited about that.
Do you think that goes for the people around Boris Johnson as well?
I don't know that. I guess you're talking about Dominic Cummings and some of those people. I don't know that, but you know, there's a lot of extreme talk in this conversation, and it was all really around Brexit. And you know, you have very extreme positions like the Lib Dems, and you had very extreme positions like the Brexit Party. And you know, they paint Dominic Cummings out to be, you know, somewhere you know, extreme as well. I don't see that. What he's delivered is a conservative. He's helped deliver a Conservative majority, and for people all over the country. You know, his strategy and the strategy that the Prime Minister had with many other people has been successful.
I mean, you've always wanted to moderate the party's position on Brexit. I mean, do you think there is any problem with a Brexit that is sensible in your terms when there are lots of people who have voted Conservative who might otherwise have voted for the Brexit Party and want something a bit harder? You know, can you actually satisfy everybody?
Actually, if you look at the 3.5 years worth of work that's been done with the civil servants, with everybody else, it is clear that what you need to do to solve the problem of Brexit is you need to get something that unpicks a 45-year-old relationship without damaging everything, and give us the opportunity to build a future collaborative arrangement with the EU. That's what we'll do. It's as simple as that.
Gillian Keegan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, while Boris Johnson has been talking about unity, hundreds of protesters descended outside Downing Street tonight.
Boris Johnson!
Whitehall was briefly closed to traffic in both directions as the crowds waving placards declaring "Defy Tory Rule" began heading northwards towards London's busy Piccadilly. Well, we'll be back here in Westminster later in the programme, but now over to Kathy, who's in Wakefield.
Thanks, Krish. Welcome to the Red Shed, the Labour club in Wakefield, a constituency once the cornerstone of the party's so-called Red Wall. Now, that's a swathe of the country which marks out from coast to coast huge areas of solid Labour seats. But now that Red Wall has crumbled, with the Conservatives picking up a host of those seats instead. Many of the 60 Labour MPs who lost their jobs last night turned angrily on Jeremy Corbyn, saying he was simply unelectable. But for plenty of voters across the north, it was the party's ambiguity over Brexit which was to blame. Like here in Wakefield, where Labour's Mary Cray was a prominent Remain voice and suffered the consequences as the Conservatives won for the first time since 1931. Our political correspondent Liz Bates is here. Well, Liz, this was a historic night here, wasn't it? What did you make of it?
Yeah, it was. And the thing that really stood out for me, actually, was the political shift that's happened in this area. I grew up just down the road from here in Rotherham, and to see those seats last night going Conservative, that just wouldn't have happened a few years ago. So big change over a really short period of time. The second thing that I really noticed is that among Labour MPs and activists, there was a lot of shock, actually, at the level of losses that they were enduring. But when we went out into the streets and spoke to voters, they were actually not that surprised, which suggests that actually that relationship between Labour and its post-industrial heartlands has been breaking down for maybe quite a long time, longer than this general election period, certainly. And of course, this was a really difficult night for the Labour Party, but this also offers a big opportunity to the Conservatives, and they understand that, I think. I was speaking to Number 10 last night, even before the results were coming in, and they were saying they understand that they have to adapt their programme for government to reflect the political needs of these huge swathes of new voters that they have across the country. So that is the political challenge that Boris Johnson will face during his premiership. But of course, a really tough night for Labour last night, and this is how it all played out.
In Bolsover, Derbyshire, rehearsals for the Christmas production are in full swing, but it's in the room next door that the real drama is unfolding. Voters here and across the north are turning out, but this time they're painting these Labour heartland towns blue.
Conservatives.
First time ever.
First time ever, both of you first time ever?
Yeah.
Can I quickly ask you why? Is that you've changed, you've switched?
Don't like Corbyn.
The polls had narrowed, but on the doorstep, Labour activists had heard that Brexit and their party leader were driving voters away. As voting closed, boxloads of ballot papers swiftly turned those fears into devastating reality.
And I do hereby declare that Mark Peter Fletcher is elected to serve as Member of Parliament for the constituency of Bolsover.
And as Labour's Red Wall began to collapse, there were more casualties down the road in Doncaster.
Caroline Flint has just lost her Don Valley seat here tonight amid a Labour collapse in its heartlands. The senior figures are blaming Brexit, but there are much more fundamental questions for the party to answer. What happened tonight for Labour?
I just want to have a bit of time.
Can I just ask you, is it time for Jeremy Corbyn to step down now?
Yeah. Yes.
Who is to blame for what's happened to Labour tonight?
I think there's a combination of factors at play. One is, I think, Jeremy Corbyn is a leader. Time and time again on the doorstep, people said, I like you, I'm a Labour through and through. My dad was a miner, my granddad was a miner, he'd be turning in his grave if I didn't vote Labour, but I just can't vote Labour whilst that man is your leader. And what has most cut me the last couple of years is the disrespect that has been meted out to my voters, because they voted Leave.
The current Labour leader has said he won't fight another election, but a former Labour leader wasn't in the mood to talk.
Mr Miliband, this is a terrible, terrible night for your party. Do you really have nothing to say at all?
Across Yorkshire, 9 Labour seats went Conservative, including Wakefield.
Mary Cray lost her Wakefield seat here last night. She was one of dozens of Labour MPs to lose out as the party suffered its biggest defeat since 1935. And as one senior insider pointed out to me, it could have been so much worse, with many more seats seeing huge majorities slashed to just 1,000 or 2,000, creating a sea of marginals in what used to be a Labour-dominated landscape. This morning, the party, rather than uniting to face up to this defeat, is more divided than ever over who or what is to blame.
I'm absolutely elated.
Brilliant.
Why? Jeremy Corbyn.
Oh. Do him. Can't we Corbyn?
Can I ask you guys who you voted for?
Sorry?
Conservative.
Yes.
Have you ever?
Normally I'm Labour.
Will people ever go back to Labour, do you think?
I think so. I think it was a bit of a protest vote. We'll wait and see.
So the voters have spoken. The question now is, can Labour rebuild the Red Wall or have the Tories torn it down for good?
Well, I'm joined now by Labour's Shadow Minister for Women and Equalities, Naz Shah. Naz Shah, should the leadership take responsibility for this historic defeat?
I think there's a lot of responsibility to be had by lots of people, and
but not
one
the
of them. But the leadership is taking responsibility because what Jeremy has said, that he will not be taking us in to a next general election. I think that's the right thing to do.
But he's blamed the media. He's blamed Brexit. He hasn't said I blame myself.
Well, Brexit has played a role, Kath, and we know that. We've seen that by the results, the kind of results that we've had, in those largely Leave seats. Mary's here in Wakefield. She was a heavy Remainer. She was very clear about her position, and that's the price that, but it's really, really sad for us as a Labour Party, and particularly for the colleagues that have lost seats this evening,
But shouldn't there have been a little bit more humility from the leadership, an apology even to those 60 colleagues of yours who lost their seats?
I'm very, very sorry, and I understand that Jeremy did say he was very sorry this morning for the 60 people that have lost their seats. That's my understanding of it, and I'm very sorry that we've lost so many colleagues, very, very, very good people up and down the country. It really, really is heartbreaking, and I'm sorry for our constituents and my constituents, who've returned me to Parliament to be their voice, and to the idea of a Tory for the next 5 years of continued austerity that will impact on places like where I come from, Bradford West. It really is heartbreaking.
You mentioned Brexit. You've said you're sorry for the losses of your colleagues. Was Jeremy Corbyn ultimately just unelectable?
Our policies, if we look at 2017, Kath, so what we had a manifesto. That manifesto we went out on gave us the results that we had in 2017. And in fairness, the 2017, when we had the ideas that we put in this manifesto, they were also very popular. But the manifesto did not cut through Brexit.
Yeah, but because of the leadership. Time and again on the doorstep, Labour MPs, your colleagues who've lost their seat and those that kept them, said Jeremy Corbyn kept on coming up. There was an opinion poll which said 43% of people said that the reason they didn't vote Labour was because of Jeremy Corbyn.
I think these are the conversations. I think these are the conversations that the leadership and the NEC need to be having, the Shadow Cabinet need to be having once we get back to London, and once people have, we need to be having those conversations and really, really digressing and thinking what did go wrong.
The union boss, Len McCluskey, said that one of the key reasons for Labour losing was the allegations of anti-Semitism, which he just didn't knock on the head. Now, you apologised for an anti-Semitic Facebook post that you shared. The leader seemed to find it a lot harder to apologise, didn't he?
Yes, there was. Jeremy did apologise. He apologised
belatedly,
yes.
when pushed.
Yes, so he has apologised, and I'm very, very clear that we have changed the system. What we did have was a system that wasn't fit for purpose in dealing with the level of complaints. We had an increase in membership. We've now addressed some of that. Have we done enough?
Should he have apologised faster?
Jeremy has said himself he would have done things differently and apologised, and I think absolutely that's a fair point, that we could have done things differently. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been in that position.
Just quickly, the next Labour leader, should it be a woman in your view?
Well, I think that conversation hasn't started until the NEC has made a decision, but yes, I would love to see a woman leading the Labour Party, and that would be amazing.
Angela Rayner, Becca Long-Bailey?
We've got amazing talent, we really have got some amazing women in the Labour Party, so yeah, we'll see when we get back.
Naz Shah, thanks very much for joining me. So now, well, at one end of the all-important Red Wall is Tony Blair's former seat of Sedgefield. It was always considered rock-solid Labour, but now it has a new Conservative MP. Our North of England correspondent Claire Fallon is there. Claire.
Well, when you think Sedgefield, chances are you think Tony Blair, 1997, Labour landslide, and in the last 24 hours, we have had another huge shift in British politics. The Red Wall, as it's been described, is now frankly more of a collection of red islands across the north and the Midlands. But this is Sedgefield. It's Tony Blair's old constituency. It's been Labour since the 1930s. It's an old mining area, and it had a majority of 6,000. So few seriously thought that Sedgefield would go blue, and yet it did. Earlier today, I spoke to the now ex-Labour MP for this area. He told me all of this is about more than Brexit. We'll hear from him in a moment. But first, let's hear from the new Conservative MP.
I don't want it to be just the Brexit decision, but it's up to me. It's up to me to prove that Conservatives can look after this part of the world, and that's what we'll do.
You're saying that the Tory party needs to now be a party of the North. By inference, it hasn't been up until this point.
Well, if you actually come round and knock a few doors with me, what you'll find is actually the comment goes further back than that. What I get is Tony Blair was our Prime Minister, he was our MP, and he didn't do anything for us here. He was too busy doing other things.
When you've got people who were Labour voters all their lives saying to you on the doorstep, Phil, I can't vote Labour this time, that man is stopping me from voting Labour. And these are people in the 70s and the 80s who've been Labour all their lives, and it's just heartbreaking, really, you know, to actually put your own supporters through that, to make a choice of not being able to vote Labour anymore, but to vote Tory, to make sure that the leader of the Labour Party doesn't become Prime Minister. And that's tragic.
But you know, it's also worth saying, I think, that there is really a brutal reality of politics, because last night 60 people who were the sitting MP in their constituency, who were hoping to carry on representing their area, went to account and found out that they were out of a job. But it's not just the MPs, because bear in mind there are also members of staff who work for members of Parliament, and they also, many of them, will be out of a job.
Claire, thanks very much. Well, joining us now from Wakefield is the newly elected Conservative MP, Imran Ahmed Khan. Congratulations. What do you think was the biggest factor in that demolition of the Red Wall?
I think, of course, Brexit was a big matter. But what does Brexit mean? What does it mean to the people of Wakefield? I think they're tired of politicians telling them what to think. There are a lot of daughters, husbands, wives, children of coal miners that were very, very annoyed that they had been told by Islington Remainers and others that had come up to get them to vote for Remain in the referendum 2016.
You voted Brexit yourself?
I did. They were told when they didn't agree with those people that they were either stupid, uneducated, racist or wrong. And there was a massive rejection of this, and it was as if the Labour Party had left them behind. Also,
well, how is the Conservative Party under Boris Johnson going to make sure that you keep those former Labour voters on board?
Well, I hope that the Conservative Party will reorientate itself entirely to the people, to the strivers and the aspirational. They are the natural Conservatives. What people of Wakefield want, I have found, is a party that's going to be with them every step of the way as they improve their lives, who can provide first-class services both in education, the health service.
It hasn't been the case, has it? And the former Conservative governments have cut on health and education.
Well, you see, that narrative is often used by Labour proponents.
Well, it happens to be true, though.
Well, actually, it doesn't. So in Wakefield, for example, the people here are canny enough, and they don't need people talking down to them from Islington or elsewhere. So we have a PFI deal that was done under Andy Burnham, the present mayor of Manchester. And in fact, my predecessor, Mary Quay, was a junior health minister at the time. It was a 200 or so million pound investments costing billions. And it was based on Wonga.com terms. And the people realise they're not getting good services because of a really bad privatisation deal orchestrated by Labour, not the Tories.
But do you believe that Boris Johnson is a one-nation Tory?
I absolutely do. More importantly than that even, I believe in Conservative ethos of aspiration, of enterprise, and also that the citizen is king. and not the state. Marxism and socialism and the people of Wakefield have rejected this, and indeed across Yorkshire, that the state should be master over the citizen and the citizen subject.
Now the previous candidate, you're a sort of bit of a Johnny-come-lately actually here. I mean, the previous candidate had to step down after some racist social media posts were found. Do you think the Conservatives do have a deep Islamophobia problem?
First of all, I take exception to being a Johnny-come-lately. I was born in this constituency. My father was the dermatologist
the
here.
Candidate.
My mother did her nurse training here. My grandmother was the night sister at the local hospital.
Fair enough.
I went to school here. So
Okay.
Johnny-come-lately is certainly not. I think somebody who was raised in Coventry and was a campaign office manager for Mary Queen could be for
But
Corbyn
is there
could
an
be Johnny-come-lately.
Islamophobia problem?
I don't find it. I think all
Should
parties...
there be an inquiry to establish that?
I believe all forms of racism and prejudice of any sort, whether it's about religion or sexuality or gender, should be rooted out. It has no place in a decent society. And
But
wherever
when
there is
Boris
a
Johnson
problem,
writes
wherever
about
there's a
Muslim
problem,
women, compares them to letterboxes and bank boxes. Did you take offence
this
at
old
that?
banana.
Did you find that offensive?
No. Because read the context. The context was saying that women everywhere should be empowered to dress as they wish. And
But
of course,
there was
as a
spike
journalist,
in racist attacks after that column.
well, there's
do you feel
correlation
worried
and
about
causation, as you know very well, are two very, very separate things. And you will also know as a journalist, sensationalism is a very good way to attract people to read your article. Mr. Johnson, as a great journalist, was doing just that. Now he's a statesman, now he's a Prime Minister, his language will be slightly more tempered.
Imran Ahmed Khan, thank you very much for coming into the Lion's Den, the Labour Club here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
After the break, we're in Wrexham in Wales, where voters deserted Jeremy Corbyn to elect the town's first Conservative since the 1930s. But before that, we'll return to Krish.
Thanks, Kathy. Well, that's the story in the north of England. But what's the reaction been elsewhere in the United Kingdom and Europe? In a moment, we'll hear from our correspondents in Belfast, in Brussels and in Wrexham. But first, let's go to our Scotland correspondent, Kieran Jenkins, who's in Edinburgh, where Nicola Sturgeon has been setting out her plans for another independence referendum.
Yes, Krishnan, and the Prime Minister and Nicola Sturgeon have actually been speaking on the phone this evening. He told her what she already knows, that he's against a second independence referendum. She told him to respect the mandate that she says the SNP now has. Boris Johnson's Conservatives pummeled in Scotland, Labour eviscerated, the SNP swept the Westminster parties away. Nicola Sturgeon could have a formal request for an independence vote on Boris Johnson's desk within days.
Minister, how are you feeling? Feeling pretty good.
In Scotland, the only landslide was hers. A watershed moment, says Nicola Sturgeon. She will request a referendum on independence within days that Boris Johnson has long said he'll flat out refuse.
To the Prime Minister, let me be very clear. This is not simply a demand that I or the SNP are making. It is the right of the people of Scotland.
The SNP message is evolving. A campaign fought on the words "Stop Brexit." Today, the podium reads, "Scotland's choice." Your bus, what did it say?
Stop Brexit.
Now you're saying something else. You're saying this is an endorsement of a second independence referendum.
There was three aspects. I probably said them to you in interviews many times to the SNP's campaign. Stop Boris Johnson, stop Brexit and put Scotland's future into Scotland's hands.
But for the Tories in Scotland, this was an election on independence, stopping it their flagship pitch.
We don't want another referendum on Scotland, we don't.
And they lost more than half their seats. Boris Johnson now talks of uniting the country, even as Scotland embraced MPs seeking a vote on breaking away. For how long, realistically, can he keep saying no? The Prime Minister may be emboldened by Labour's gloomy prospects. They used to forge majorities with Scottish MPs. Now, there's one, and he's not happy.
This party must listen, and this party must respond, or this party will die.
Boris Johnson has his mandate, so do I, says Nicola Sturgeon. The scene's set for the row of all rows over Scotland's future.
Well, in another sign of this new political landscape, for the first time, Northern Ireland now has more nationalist and Republican MPs than unionists. There were some major defeats for the Democratic Unionists, including their deputy leader, Nigel Dodds, who lost his seat to Sinn Fein. There were gains too for the SDLP and alliance parties, all three strongly opposed to Brexit. Our chief correspondent, Alex Thompson, is in Belfast.
Yes, already the Prime Minister has been on to his Irish counterpart, saying his #1 priority, restoring the power-sharing assembly here at Stormont. After a night in which unionism fell to a new low in terms of power, reach, voice, influence, a slew of nationalist and Republican pro-Remain parties, though, had a very strong night. So strong, some already openly campaigning to further that strategy in very much an all-Ireland, not a UK context. All in all, quite a night. The very essence of the story, Republican John Finucane, his father murdered by loyalists, leading the political shock of the night, wiping the DUP Westminster leader off the political map on a night that brought unionist power here to a new low. Commiserations, but the DUP's pivotal days in the Commons are gone. Sinn Féin now working Brexit in an all-Ireland context, if not a united Ireland.
Our protections will come from making sure that our voice is heard in Dublin, making sure our voice is heard in Brussels, and I think, to be fair, that is a negotiating position that's been hardwired into the Irish government, the European Union, from very early doors.
Major gains too for the equally anti-Brexit SDLP, winning in Belfast and Derry and attacking Sinn Féin for refusing to take Westminster seats or Stormont ones at present.
The people of Derry who've just said enough is enough. They're fed up having their representative standing outside looking in the window. They want people to be in there, whether that's in Westminster fighting for us or Stormont delivering for us, because they can see the public sector is crumbling.
Talks begin on Monday to attempt to get the power-sharing assembly here at Stormont functioning again after 3 years. Years which have seen public services like the NHS fall into genuine crisis, as all parties here agree. The DUP down from 10 to 8 MPs, and knowing they've lost in numbers but in influence too. The Tories can simply ignore them to deliver a Brexit this party regards as a sellout, with its border in the Irish Sea.
We will stand up for Northern Ireland, as we always do. We will use whatever influence we have in Westminster, and we will use the relationships that we have built up over this past 2.5 years to work for the good of Northern Ireland. That's what we intend to do.
Brave rhetoric, of course, but their losses over here and a Tory landslide over there add up to a new low in unionist influence inside and outside Northern Ireland. Alex Thompson, Channel 4 News, Belfast.
Well, over in Brussels, European leaders say they are expecting newly elected MPs to vote on Mr Johnson's withdrawal agreement as soon as possible, while Chancellor Merkel of Germany questioned the Prime Minister's claim that he can get a second agreement, a trade deal with the EU, by the end of next year. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Jonathan Rugman is in Brussels. Jonathan.
There is relief here in Brussels that the UK is finally on course to leave the EU at the end of next month. But what about the next battle over the trade agreement? Well, Angela Merkel, who congratulated Boris Johnson tonight, has described the UK as an enemy, a competitor, I should say, on Europe's doorstep, reinforcing comments from President Macron of France that the UK must agree to EU rules and regulations as the price for any future free trade deal. Boris Johnson's absence from today's summit is a sign of things to come. His overnight gift to the EU's chief negotiator,
yes,
nice to see
I am Mr. Barnier,
is that the British are leaving in 49 days' time.
We have been waiting for 1 year for the UK to tell us what it wants. Now we have clarity, and obviously I want to tell my best wishes. We wish all the best to the Prime Minister of UK, Boris Johnson, and to the government of UK.
But how long will this bonhomie last, given the Prime Minister's next deadline, a trade deal with all 27 EU leaders in 1 year's time? Does the clarity of the result in Westminster, in your view, make it easier to strike a trade deal next year?
I think it does. Striking a trade deal by the end of 2020 is enormously ambitious, but we won't achieve it if we don't try, and we're determined to try. And I think the fact that Prime Minister Johnson has a clear majority and has been given a big personal mandate as well makes a big difference.
Though not all the UK's biggest trading partners are that confident. Chancellor Merkel of Germany called a deal by next year very complicated, warning that it may take longer.
Our biggest hurdle will be that we need to sort out these issues very quickly. We need to conclude by the end of next year and decide by June whether we want to extend the negotiation period.
Still, the Prime Minister's critics here now admit that last night's election result does for the moment clear the air.
I still regret the outcome of the referendum, but I respect it, and I'm happy that it will be finally now over with this situation where we are able to agree here, but in London they're not able to agree. So finish this situation. And that.
Jonathan Rugman, Channel 4 News, Brussels.
Well, those protests that were outside Downing Street earlier this evening have now made their way down here. They're carrying Defy Tory Rule posters, but they're still moving and moving past. Well, a year ago, Boris Johnson was a frustrated backbencher, railing against Theresa May's leadership. Today, he has led his party to a triumphant victory, talking of healing and one nation conservatism. But from a man who has often expressed contradictory beliefs, just what do we know about the Prime Minister and what he really thinks? Joining me now are Salma Shah, a former special advisor to Conservative government ministers, and Xavier Ranger, who worked with Boris Johnson as Director of Transport Policy when he was Mayor of London. Salma Shah, I mean, a lot of people are suspicious of what is the real Boris Johnson. Is it the determined fighter who prorogued Parliament and did all those things when he didn't have a majority, or is he this magnanimous one-nation Tory who we see on the steps of Downing Street?
I think the ultimate Boris Johnson is someone who's very pragmatic, which is definitely something that you've seen from what he said on Downing Street today. Just referencing this protest that's coming back, you can see his absolute need to try and have a unifying one nation Tory message. So what we are seeing is a transition from campaigning Boris Johnson into statesman Boris Johnson. And I actually think it gives a lot of people some comfort that he's moving into that mould.
Xavier Ranger, I mean, you worked for him, and obviously you're a fan, but I mean, explain why you believe the more liberal Boris Johnson.
Well, I worked with him, you're right, and what I saw was Boris before he became Mayor of London, and in fact, if we rewind to late 2007, Boris was a late replacement to be the mayoral candidate when the then candidate, Nick Bowles, actually became ill. And at that point, Boris had to work out what he was going to stand for to be Mayor of London and, in fact, win this city over to Tories and reach out to non-traditional Tory voters. And what he does and what he's done best throughout his career is listen to people. He spends a lot of time listening to a broad spectrum of people, which is why people have said Boris is the Heineken politician. He sort of gets his finger on the pulse of things. That's his listening. And then what he does is he makes his promises and commitments based on what he's heard. Then, as Salma is demonstrating and saying, what he moves into is the statesman who delivers. And it's delivery that then gets him that momentum to keep doing more and more.
So I suppose what you're both saying is that by a sort of quirk of fate, Boris Johnson's ended up in a similar position now. In whether he believes it or not, pragmatically, he's got to appeal to Labour voters because he wants to be re-elected.
Yeah, but he's just been elected by traditional Labour voters. And what he said last night was, trust me, we know that you've lent us your vote. So he knows that he's got to consolidate this victory much further by changing tack slightly now that he is a Prime Minister sitting on a big majority. But you can't traditionally
please everyone, can you? How can you please the right and the left?
No, this is true. But there will be ways, once he gets through Brexit, which is going to be an incredibly complicated process, there are ways that you can do that. Margaret Thatcher did it and Tony Blair did it, both on opposing side, appealing to different people. So there have been everyman leaders previously.
And he did it before, because the second election in London, which we fought, he defied, as it was said then, the laws of political gravity. I think the Conservative Party was 17 or 18 points behind in the polls in London. He, with his personal mandate, won that election, and that was by reaching across, by demonstrating he was a one nation mayor or one city mayor at that point, reaching out, and that's what he's going to demonstrate, I think, as Prime Minister, and that's what he's starting with right now.
How will he square, Brexit and immigration controls with his old immigration amnesty positions and things like that.
It's
and
the pragmatism.
Do both things?
It's the pragmatism. It's all that view that says people want to see an element of control. They don't want draconian policies. They don't want radicalism. We've seen what's happened when a party presents radicalism to people. They run away from it. He will find the answers that will reach that middle ground, and he will be exactly in the middle ground and retain that space, whether it comes to security, whether it comes to investment.
He will have to make compromises, undoubtedly, and those compromises will come at some kind of personal cost to him and his leadership. But those are things that we will wait and see how they actually pan out. You know, the truth is he's got this fantastic majority, but he has a hell of a job to do with delivering Brexit.
And I mean, we're in the almost absurd, I mean, it is absurd, it's not almost absurd situation of no sooner are you elected than minds turn to 5 years down the road and how you're re-elected.
Yeah, and do you know what? There is no point in doing that, because as a veteran of campaigns, as Xavier is as well, I remember the elation after the 2015 campaign when the Tories came back with a small majority and pundits were saying, oh God, this is going to be like the next Tory decade. And look at what happened. There is no predicting what's going to happen in 5 years, because a week is a long time, as we all know.
Sam was absolutely right. These are the moments when people all like to project forward the next election. What will it mean for the Labour Party at the next election? Where will the Liberal Democrats be? Really, it's about what's going to happen next year. And Boris now has to take this momentum that he's got from this mandate. He has to progress the Brexit conversation, and he has to start delivering, as Sam says, some of those promises that he's made. People will want to see the proof of the pudding on the streets and around the country.
Xavier Ranger, Sam Michel, thank you both very much.